Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast, a Breitbart production with me, James Delingpole, and my very special and exciting guest, Tim Price. Tim is a fund manager. By weird coincidence, he also read English at the same college as me at Oxford a few years before me. We had the same tutor, but Tim chose possibly the more lucrative path than journalism and became a fund manager, whereas I became a mere hack. And Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Why did you become a fund manager rather than a journalist or something Englishy?
I like to think I've managed to have my cake and eat it, if that isn't too Johnsonian a phrase. Yeah. So when I graduated in 91, I couldn't get a job in journalism or advertising, which were the two careers that I was interested in at the time. And out of what you could call polite desperation, I took the first job that came my way, which happened to be a job in bond sales for a Japanese bank. Right.
I'm really glad you're here because actually, although I don't know much about economics, although I probably know more about economics than somebody who read PPE.
But that's not a very high barrier.
It's not a very high. It's true, isn't it? That they don't even get taught about Hayek or Mises or anything.
It's worse. I think it's worse than that, to the extent that we're sort of piling in quite cheerfully to Oxford #OxfordPPE on Twitter. But
I hate them.
But the problem I would identify is that it's not limited to our alma mater. The Cambridge course, at least as in the 80s, was a pure economics course, and I know this because my brother went on it. And he did concede after the fact when I asked him how much, for example, the so-called Austrian school of people like Ludwig von Mises, how much of the Cambridge degree course included any reference to that? And of course the answer came back, none whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, that we did another podcast which you might enjoy with Neil Monnery, the author of a book on John Cooperthwaite.
Is he Hong Kong?
Yes, the Hong Kong man.
Yeah.
Who first studied classics, I think, a degree, and then he did economics, but he did classical economics. So he did, the Adam Smith and stuff before economics tried to become this science with all these dubious numbers flying around.
Most of what I've got out of economics has been through reading the outpourings of far more intelligent people than me, and I'm just trying to think of the text that I first came across this, but I've been able to trace it back to not Bastiat, but a Léon Walras. It's a French guy, Léon Walras, who by all accounts failed at everything he turned his hand to, and in desperation, sort of Walras Senior took his son for a walk one night in whenever it was, the late 19th century, and said, I think you should, have a look at this new science of economics. And then Walras Jr. basically just conceded to nick a whole bunch of principles from the world of physics and then misapply them incorrectly to the world of this new world of economics. But the classical school, or the so-called Austrian school, particularly under Mises, is that, the economy is us. The economy is you and me and 7 billion other people, all exchanging goods and services. So, well, you could have a model of that, but it would have to be a model involving 7 billion people. Anything short of that is going to be a waste of time.
So, I mainly wanted to talk about the amazing and shocking revelation in this book you wrote, a couple of years ago?
Yeah.
Investing Through the Looking Glass, where you talk about the 2008 bank crisis and how much the bailout cost. And it is truly amazing. I've got. Do you want to read it out, or shall I?
Go for it.
It's absolutely extraordinary. So you quote somebody called Jim Bianco of Bianco Research, who puts the U.S. bailout figures in context, and he goes through the most expensive U.S. government expenditures, I think, in history: the Marshall Plan, the Louisiana Purchase, the Race to the Moon, Savings and Loan Crisis, the Korean War, the New Deal, invasion of Iraq, the Vietnam War, and the NASA program. And when you add all those up together, presumably you're adding those up in inflation-adjusted terms.
Correct.
Okay.
Or Jim Bianco is, yes.
Jim Bianco is. Okay. And the aggregate total of all these government expenditures is $3.9 trillion, which is still 686 billion less than the cost of the credit crisis in the US. That's how much the US taxpayer spent bailing out the banks.
That presupposes that those figures are static, but in reality, they were the case. That was the case perhaps a decade ago. We've amassed, or collectively, the government, the G7 governments have amassed probably trillions more on top of that. Certainly, we know that the global debt pile has grown by trillions in excess of whatever it got to in '08. So, words like unprecedented are bandied around with a lot of ease these days. But we've never, you kind of need new linguistic skills. You need new vocabulary to get to just how extraordinary a financial period we're in. I probably have a reputation for being something of a Perma Bear, and probably some of that is warranted. Nevertheless, we are in such uncharted territory. It's like living in outer space.
Right, but why is it? I mean, given that those figures are out there and they're not probably that disputable, how is it that so few people appreciate just how bad it was?
I think for most people, the extent to which governments are heavily indebted is completely irrelevant to them. I mean, it's not. So take the debt market. The debt. I mean, I started out in fixed income sales. So I spent the first 10 years of my career as a bond salesman, as a generalist bond salesman. So I would make a defense for anybody that's working in finance. I'd make a defense for the fixed income market, for the bond market, because I had no prior economic training or whatever. But the beauty of the bond market is that when you start working within it, it gives you very, very quickly a general sense of sort of macroeconomic stuff. If you're involved in the bond market, which is essentially just IOUs issued by governments or corporations, then it gives you a sense of the importance of interest rates, of inflation, of GDP figures, of growth. And all of that stuff is useful for making sense of the financial world. So the bond market gives you that, whereas the equity market, the stock market is just people telling tales.
Right. But
despite the fact, so to your question, it is alarming, let's say, that whereas every news bulletin and certainly financial bulletin will incorporate information about the performance of the major stock indices, the FTSE 100 if it's the UK, or the S&P 500 if it's the States. The reality is that the bond market is multiple times bigger by value than the world stock markets, and it is barely even reported on. Now, that has been the case up until now. I suspect that with US interest rates finally starting to rise, and with the US Federal Reserve finally now withdrawing the QE stimulus that we've lived with for a decade, I think the bond market sooner or later, and probably sooner, is going to be big news once again, and not in a good way.
Well, so what will it do? What might it do?
What it could conceivably do? Well, we had a dress rehearsal for this in 1994. So in 1994, the Fed raised rates, some would say prematurely, and they caused a bit of a bond market collapse, and multiple billions of dollars were lost because Wall Street was wrong-footed by that. The debt pile, as we've sort of discussed already, is now so huge that, I mean, already the Fed sort of started edging up interest rates by baby steps, but realistically, US policy rates, what's called the Fed funds rate in the States, probably ought to be realistically 2-3% higher than it actually is. So I would argue that there is a big problem of kind of like latent inflation bubbling away, and we've just lived through the most extraordinary period of monetary stimulus in history. Interest rates have been taken down to 5,000-year lows, so the lowest levels in history. The effective prices of bonds are at their highest levels ever, and so the amount of risk that now attaches to the bond markets of the world collectively is off the charts. And at the moment, the market wobbles that we're experiencing today are restricted solely to emerging markets, particularly to emerging market sovereigns that have borrowed in dollars, because a strengthening dollar is a disaster if that's your funding currency, but you can't print it. And then you look at the situation in Europe, in the Eurozone, where you've got sovereigns that are heavily indebted, but they're not in a position to dictate monetary policy, because that's the job of Mario Draghi. So I would argue that just in a euro context, the nature of the bond market is it's like a doomsday machine. It's bound to blow up. We just don't know how long they can keep papering over the cracks through more stimulus.
And when it does blow up, what tools will they have to deal with this?
It's an excellent question. So you could argue that what happened in 07 and 08, when you had the Lehman Brothers failure and then effectively a run on the global banking system, that what was a corporate problem, a problem for the banking system, suddenly got sort of kicked up a grade and it became a sovereign problem, i.e. government stepped in to do what the private sector couldn't do, namely absorb the cost of clearing that bad debt. Well, now governments are in the same problem in 2018 that the corporate sector was in 10 years ago. So unless we get invaded by benign aliens, there's no
higher force.
There's no higher force that this can be kicked up to.
Oh my goodness.
So it's kind of like answers on a postcard, which is one reason why we don't invest in bonds anymore, by and large. I mean, there are 4 asset classes that we allocate to within our discretionary business. And those asset classes are objectively high-quality debt, bonds, in other words, value stocks, listed businesses. We also allocate to a specific type of trading vehicle called systematic trend-following funds, which is just a pure price momentum approach. And we allocate to precious metals and to gold and to silver and to mining companies that are involved in those mining for those metals. Of those asset classes, the one that we can't realistically engage with anymore is debt, is the bond market, because as I've indicated, the prices of these instruments are now at all-time highs. In many markets, the real yields are negative. So in other words, you've got a guaranteed loss, assuming the prices of the bonds simply don't change if you hold these things to maturity. This is a complete disaster in the making, and it's a double disaster for those entities like, say, pension funds, that the regulator basically forces to own this stuff as the most appropriate asset within the portfolio.
Yeah. Well, you've described yourself as a Perma Bear, and I've, reading your book, a few familiar names cropped up, like Jim Rickards. They're a sort of regular crowd, aren't they, that are predicting doom and gloom. And of course, one day they're going to be right, and presumably they're going to make lots and lots of money out of it.
I'm not so sure it's even as straightforward as that. The one thing I'm really grateful for is that by 2007, 2008, I was already moving in what you might call sort of classical economic circles. Some people might refer to them as Austrian school economic circles, whereby, because one of the reasons why I was so delighted to be asked to write the book was that by writing the book, it gave me a sense of putting thoughts on paper as to how we'd got into this gigantic mess. And for anyone that does read the book, it's I try not to take any prisoners, so everyone gets a fair beating. I would say deservedly so. All these players in the system, but it took the experience of managing money in 2008 for me to get an appreciation of just how bad, just how corrupt the system is. The analogy I'd make would be, I like films, and the stuff that I was raised on as a kid, these were conspiracy theories from the 70s, probably my favourite of which would be, I think, Capricorn 1. Have you seen that film? It's where they fake a manned mission to Mars.
With O.J. Simpson?
With O.J. Simpson.
They were great.
Let's not give the game away, but basically the essential premise is it's a bit like the moon landings. They fake a mission to Mars for reasons of budget and constraints, and these things seem sort of extraordinarily far-fetched. And then you look at this stuff from the perspective of 2018, and I'm looking at things and trying to make sense of the world. I'm thinking, well, actually, these aren't swivel-eyed lunatic fantasies. They're just like documentaries about how the system actually works. Our entire monetary system is based on a house of cards.
Yeah, it's really frightening that this is happening, and I wish I could dismiss you as a complete sort of lunatic party pooper. But when I read the book, just give you another example, you talk about the creation of the Federal Reserve, and it's the Federal Reserve was basically a stitch-up, wasn't it, between various.
It was done very artfully. So in 1913, a body was created to administer the US financial system and interest rate policy and monetary creation. And it was cunningly described as the Federal Reserve Bank. It's actually a private, it's another, if I suspect if you ask the average American, if you threw a stick down Main Street, then anyone, if asked, would say, oh, it's an arm of the US government, as opposed to actually a private banking cartel run as a for-profit business for the benefit of bankers. And you say that, and people would say, "No, surely you're having a laugh," but you're not. And this is, this is chapter and verse. It's The Creature from Jekyll Island is the name of the book.
Yeah, no, I did find it extraordinary because it read like conspiracy theory.
But it turned out to be true.
Yeah, you'd think it's the kind of thing you believe in because it involves the Rothschilds. There's one of the Rothschilds was there, I think. You think it would involve the lizard-headed master race.
Absolutely.
But the fact is that it really is a stitch-up arranged by private banks to screw the taxpayer, screw the consumer.
So the scales fell from my eyes when, during particularly the sort of fever pitch stage of 2008, and I cite this at the start of the book, when there's a great, happily there's a lot of good material on this. So to some extent, journalists have delivered. There's no shortage of crisis porn out there, and one of the best is Too Big to Fail by Andrew Ross Sorkin. And there's a quote from Sorkin that I've probably used more than any other quote in my career. And it's a quote from Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan, who arranged a conference call with his board on the Saturday morning of the weekend that Lehman Brothers failed. And it goes along the following lines. So he's on basically a conference call to his colleagues on the board of JP Morgan, and he says, we should be prepared for the following. We should be prepared for Lehman Brothers filing, i.e. for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. We should be prepared for AIG filing. We should be prepared for Merrill Lynch filing. We should be prepared for Morgan Stanley filing. Pause. We should even be prepared for Goldman Sachs filing. And then it just says, there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. And you're going, well, that's not really a surprise because he's basically anticipating an extinction level event for Wall Street.
Yeah.
And so this gets to the heart of the problem. That the way I describe it is that the entire world financial system and the governments administering it or attempting to administer it through their agents, the central banks, basically they reached a fork in the road. One of the roads they could have gone down would have been, okay, well, let's do what they actually ended up doing, which is let's bail them out. So Lehman Brothers, for whatever reason, was allowed to fail, but everyone else got a bailout. So got a multi-billion-dollar bailout courtesy of the US taxpayer. And here, the government bailed out RBS, and we're still paying the price for that. But there was another road they could have gone down, which is just let these guys fail. They're bad businesses. They've been badly run. They've overextended. Now, clearly, you can't let the entire banking system just go, so it would need to have been underwritten by government. But there's no reason why they needed to bail out shareholders or bondholders. They could have let those guys whistle and then just nationalised the banks briefly. But that's not the road they took. Instead, the road they took was bailout, bailout, bailout. And we're now 10 years on from this mess, and we've still got so-called emergency low rates. Well, what's going on? And I think what's going on is what effectively happened in Japan, and we're just repeating that experience. So the most shocking, most chilling thing I've ever heard from a fellow fund manager, I heard from a gentleman in around 2001, and he said, Japan was the dress rehearsal, the rest of the world will be the main event. Now, when I heard that nearly 20 years ago, it seemed absolutely absurd. Now, looking at it from the perspective of life in 2018, it looks like a forecast.
You're listening to the Delingpole podcast, the depressing Delingpole podcast.
Realistic.
The realistic Delingpole podcast, a Breitbart production, with my special guest, Tim Price, author of Investing Through the Looking Glass and fund manager and doomster. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow.
Jeannie in Pennsylvania.
I think he's gotten away from what we really hired him to do, which is draining the swamp. If you look at the real picture of draining a swamp, you go in and you take all the water out of it. What does it leave? It leaves the gunk. He cannot get rid of the gunk. We have to get rid of the gunk. Everything he's doing, he's lowering the water so we can see who needs to go. The only way they can go is if we vote them out.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays at 6 a.m. Eastern on SiriusXM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Tim Price. And Tim Price is a fund manager and author of Investing Through the Looking Glass. Tim, if we had let the banks fail, what would have happened?
It's possible. I mean, history being what history is, there's clearly no counterfactual. You could, I think, make a plausible case that what could have happened is what happened in Japan in the 1990s. So I started my career in 91. By that point, the Japanese market had already peaked. The Japanese stock market peaked at something like 38,000 in 1989. And then their property market, their stock market, their banking system basically all failed, and they're all intertwined anyway. And as a result, Japanese banks went through the mill throughout the entirety of the 1990s. The Japanese responded by driving interest rates down to zero, and in some cases below zero, and that the banks were essentially bailed out. But because they weren't properly reformed, they just sort of lingered on like, I think I described them perhaps as malodorous zombies in the book, which is probably being too polite to them.
Yeah, but
that's and I wonder now whether that's effectively the kind of the trap that we've fallen into, that because politicians are unable or unwilling to do the correct thing, they end up doing what's politically expedient. And what's politically expedient is to kick the can down the road, as you say. So rather than take the pain today, you effectively end up deferring the pain, potentially, or making the pain last for another 10, 20 years.
But hang on a second. I read Money Week, and you write, I think, for Money Week occasionally.
That's correct.
And I'm always reading my heroine, Merrin Somerset Webb, talking up investing in Japan, and I think I've bought into a Japanese fund on the basis of some of their advice. So if Japan is a buy, it can't be in that bad a shape, or can it?
No, that's true. But I think, Japan is a fascinating country for a number of reasons. One of them, I think, in many cases, because it's misunderstood, but also equity investors have been mauled so many times by sort of buying into the false dawns over the last 15, 20 years. It's become a scarring experience. So I think in the first case, Japan is misunderstood. Japan is often treated, I think, like a basket case because of the immensity of its government debt, which is off the charts. That said, Japan Inc., if you take the whole sovereign entity, including corporations and households, Japan is a fantastically wealthy country. It's a creditor country. So despite the fact it's got all this government debt, the average Japanese company and household is very, very wealthy. They are stoic, and they are savers by inclination. So, for example, the yen, whenever there are problems in Asia, the yen typically behaves as a safe haven currency would do. So it's not as straightforward as simply writing Japan off because of the government debt problem. The other thing about Japan, and I touched on it just now, is that people have been burnt by buying Japan before, but their banking system was the first in the developed world to enter a deflationary crisis back in 1990. So they've been dealing with this mess now for well over a quarter of a century. Now Japanese corporations have the healthiest balance sheets in the world, which would be a revelation, I think, to most people.
Yes, well, exactly. And I think one of the things about Japan is because they're
so different from us.
Because they're so different from us, and because they don't do things like fight in wars, well, not since 1945, and they don't do much on the international stage. But are they not the fourth biggest economy? Or
I think they're the third.
Oh my goodness!
I think they're the third biggest economy on the planet.
So do they show the example of how we could live in a world without banks? Or not?
No, I just think that their example has been how long it takes to get out of basically. There was a letter to the FT, and I may even have quoted it in the book, but it's a letter to the FT from a Japanese gentleman who says, he finds it bitterly ironic that everyone, in the West is now, obsessed, and the letter's 10 years old, but that everyone in the West is obsessed with sort of the Fed policy and, managing interest rates and, and get bailouts and all this kind of stuff. And he says, no, the reality is, Japan got there first. And he says, basically, there is nothing you can do if you suffer from a catastrophic property market bust, but endure, to use his precise phrase, years of economic indignity. What a wonderfully Japanese coinage that is.
Yeah.
Years of economic indignity.
Yeah. So
there's no quick fix to that.
Just going back to an earlier question, which was on my mind. I'm a particular... I'm not a fan of the vampire squid. I think that Goldman Sachs is just pure evil. And one of my other podcast guests, Simon Corkwell, you must know him.
Yes.
Evil Knievel.
Evil Knievel.
Now, he was very sanguine about the evils of banks. His view on the kind of the financial markets was that they do what they do, they are who they are, don't expect them to be lovely, they're sharks, they behave as they are. Our job is just to make money according to whether they make the right decision or the wrong decision by, being a bear or being a bull. To me, as an ordinary person who's slightly less cynical than Evil Knievel, it strikes me as outrageous that Goldman Sachs was thigh deep in the gore of the... I mean, they did much to create the financial crisis, and they never paid a price for it. Why were they let off the hook?
I suppose you could attribute it to lobbying, to lobby power. Follow the money. For example, which organisations were the most generous in sponsoring support for Remain during Brexit? I think you'll find it was city firms, including Goldman Sachs. So in many respects, their activity and their money rewards, if you like, prior favours done. The reason this gets so dangerous is that it kind of pollutes the well for everybody when there is no day of reckoning for, let's call it, malinvestment, for bad businesses, for bad decisions. I don't think anyone would begrudge bankers for what they're paid if it was acknowledged that they run genuine risk in the pursuit of that profit. But if that's not the way it's been. The reality is that the way it's been is that bankers have been able to pursue a heads I win, tails you lose approach to the conduct of their business, whereby they're not playing with their money, they're playing with effectively other people's money at the end of the day, and that other people's money became government money in 2008, i.e. taxpayers' money. I don't think people would mind so much that these guys were paid so well if there was a genuine risk that they ran the risk of failure. But that's not the case, because as we saw, and this is I think the reason why probably both of us feel so strongly about this, if banks are allowed to perpetuate themselves irrespective of how they behave economically in terms of generating profits and loss, then that's not capitalism, it's crony capitalism.
Exactly. I think that the phenomenon you're talking about is moral hazard, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what it's called when too big to fail. It's one of those issues where I can identify with Occupy or all those angry people who say, well, hang on a second, you bailed out the banks. And it seems to me that capitalism, or the right, however you want to call them, have never successfully answered this charge because they are complicit in it. I mean, so many of the Conservatives have not denounced too big to fail. They've not denounced the bailouts. They were very much part of it.
To be honest, I suspect it comes down to something as simple as the fact that, it's easy for me to sort of opine from my, if you like, ivory tower in the city.
Yeah.
But, that's partly because I've had the, let's say, dubious benefit of working in the capital markets for the last 25 years.
Yeah.
If I hadn't had that experience, I wouldn't know about this conspiracy that's being conducted in plain sight. So, if it's I can be absolutely honest. It took me until 2008 to get a sort of even a vague inkling of what was going on. Well, if that's the case for a capital markets professional, how on earth should we expect either members of the public or politicians who aren't trained in the dark arts of finance? How should we expect these people to know what's going on? So when you got the banks queuing up to get bailed out in 2008, how could there have been realistically a political push back to say no, we're going to let one of you go pour encourager les autres?
Yeah. Also, it doesn't help, I think, that all the people that most of the people who write about finance are part of the problem. I mean, they buy into the system, don't they? You don't read many people in the financial sections of the newspapers denouncing this kind of behaviour.
I'd like to think that in this respect, the magazine Money Week is on the side of the angels. So people like Merrin and
yeah, but Money Week's a maverick. It's not the mainstream.
No, that's true. So so let's point the fingers at the guilty men. The two journals I would say the journals of financial report in the UK are the Financial Times and the Economist.
The E-communist.
The EU communist.
Yeah.
Now, I've had practically stand-up fights with writers for the FT, including Martin Wolf.
Yeah.
And I'd say, and I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that the FT is overrun by Marxist commentators. Now you could disagree with that, but I'd say, well, I can cite chapter and verse, and we can sort of start making the selective quotes. But I don't get the sense that the FT is for full-throated free market entrepreneurial capitalism. I think it's for statism, and I think you could argue the exact same point for The Economist. The Economist, I would have assumed, would be about free trade, but based on their die-hard support for Remain, I just don't think that's the case.
Totally. And I've often wondered about this. You're obviously a Brexiteer as well. I don't even need to ask you what side you're on. But we're often accused by Remainers of basing our decision on a kind of ill-informed sort of peasants' revolt. We were the underclass.
17.4 million peasants.
Yeah, 17.4 million peasants. But the implication is that we weren't well informed enough, that we weren't educated enough to make the right decision. But I think that what people were really, really voting for, or rather voting against when they voted to leave the European Union, was precisely this kind of Davos-type blob that controls the financial system and looks after its own interests.
A self-serving political elite, perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't comment for the others. I can only comment for myself. As far as I was concerned, and this was not really a business decision. I didn't pat my wallet before I went in to vote in 2016. The issue for me is effectively around exactly the same issues that led me to write the book, which is, now, how would I describe my approach to, let's say, economics and life? I'd say I think there's a danger that people just go for sort of narrow definitions like left and right, and I don't think they're up to the task anymore.
No,
I think the issue is it's really about the distinction between authoritarianism, brackets the EU, and libertarianism, brackets Brexit, i.e. leave. So for me, the crucial aspect of leave was a chance to rebuild our sense of national confidence and tell overarching bureaucrats in Brussels just to go jog off.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd agree with that analysis that left and right are no longer really meaningful terms. I mean, you look at the debate over whether is Trump a true Republican or is he a Democrat. Actually, these are kind of...
I think he transcends those labels.
These are labels, and it's very interesting that Trump, who I support massively, is also massively on the side of Brexit. And I think the Brexit revolution and the Trump revolution are one and the same. And it's interesting that how one's political alliances have changed. I mean, Brendan O'Neill, for example, who's been on the podcast twice, sort of self-defines as a Marxist. I suppose I would call myself a classical liberal stroke libertarian, conservative, stroke conservatarian, whatever. But the point is that we have far more in common than I do with, say, Nicholas Soames, stalwart of the Conservative Party, Guards, Winston Churchill's grandson, who's an arch Remainer.
Yeah, I mean, if I were asked for my own perspective, I'd describe it as classic libertarian, what I understand as classic libertarian. And to put flesh on that bone, it would be three specific attributes: a belief in sound money, a belief in small government, and a belief in libertarian principles. Chief among those is, I don't want to tell anyone else how to live. I just want to be left alone myself.
But we've seen what's happening with Brexit, with Theresa May's white paper produced by an arch Remainer in her cabinet, Ollie Robbins, just absolutely ideologically committed to ever closer union with Europe. It's starting to look like a complete stitch-up, isn't it, between the Remain establishment and the EU? I
mean, as you know, we both spend time on, probably too much time for our own good, but time on Twitter.
Yeah.
And there's someone, I can't remember his name, but there's an American friend or someone I found on Twitter. I waded in to some late night Twitter. It wasn't a storm, it was just someone posting about Churchill. You mentioned Soames, mentioned Churchill. On the back of this, let's say, serendipitous exchange I had, he recommended a book called The Last Line, which I'm now reading with extreme enthusiasm. It's probably the best biography I've read. And The Last Line is a biography of Churchill written by William Manchester and Paul Reed, and I think it was published about 5 or 6 years ago. And it's been just a revelation to me to read. I think partly because Churchill was such an interesting guy anyway. I mean, he let's say he lived life to the full. I don't think anyone could disagree with that. But he also lived at a time when this country faced some real challenges, and 2 world wars not least among them. And the thing that leapt out at me, I mean, the Last Line is huge. It's 3 volumes. each of which is over 800 pages. So it's an absolute beast of a book. So it's not exactly for casual reading. It's taken me the best part of a year to get as far in it as I have. But what leapt out to me was the comparison between, say, the second volume and what we're living through now. The second volume is called Alone, 1932 to 1940. When Churchill was completely out in the wilderness, he resigned from the cabinet over India because he didn't want India to leave the Commonwealth. And as a result, he was basically, as far as, this is the case made in the book, he was pretty much the only person in the entire country who saw the danger represented by the rise of Hitler and Nazism. And it's not just that. It's not just that Churchill was out on his own. It's also that the rest of the establishment, including the BBC, including the Times, were fantastically strong appeasers. And I'm thinking, my God, this is just like Brexit. You've got the entire weight of the establishment effectively promoting, arguing in favour of what I would term, and it sounds a bit exaggerated, a hostile foreign power.
Yeah. Yeah,
so the comparison for me completely leapt off the page, and I've been kind of gratified to see within the last few days that, I don't know if you've seen this, but the letters page of particularly the Telegraph has practically burnt into flame the vitriol and the zeal of the sort of the anti-May faction. And it just strikes me, man, I promise I'm not a particularly political person, or at least I wasn't before Brexit, but Brexit to me had the same impact on my political view as the crisis did on my economic view of the world. And it now just strikes me that unless the Conservative Party jettisons Theresa May, it isn't going to be impossible for them to win the next election.
Britain has always been at its best when it's been at its boldest.
Well, they say, I think there's a line in the book, something like, the Brits always lose every war except the last one.
Yeah. Well, look.
Or every battle except the last one.
If you go back even further in history, and to the Napoleonic Wars, what you find is that the Whiggish aristocracy were very happy to treat with Napoleon. And it was only when Arthur Wellesley decided, or maybe when did he become Duke of Wellington? Not till much later. When Wellesley decided to go and take Napoleon on in the peninsula, that suddenly the idea that we might actually take on the French and beat them rather than just kind of be surrender monkeys. So there's always been this dodgy appeasing streak among our establishment, and it's been the people.
I don't know if it was Orwell that mentioned this, or it was someone around that period, and it said something along the lines of, the intellectual elite. They've always been basically country haters. They are anti-patriots.
Yes,
patriotic.
They are absolutely appalling. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast, a Breitbart production, with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Tim Price, fund manager and author of Investing Through the Looking Glass.
Breitbart News Tonight with Joel Pollack and Rebecca Mansour.
A lot of people not knowing what action they could or should take to make the difference. What I do is try to turn people on to sites like Breitbart, people who are writing and publishing the truth so that people will get educated. But, you kind of can't blame productive members of society who are kind of confused, perplexed as to what do we do to take this government back.
Sirius XM Patriot Channel 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, a Breitbart production, and my very special guest, is Tim Price, fund manager and author of Investing Through the Looking Glass. Actually, Tim, before we go on, can I just have a quick bitch to you?
Please do.
The people I find almost more annoying than the completely out ghastly Remainers, the Ramonas, are the people who kind of hover in the middle of the argument, who sort of pretend to see both sides of the argument.
I don't see how that's physically or mentally possible.
I'm just thinking about a tweet that I read on the way here by Ian Martin. It just absolutely maddened me.
I think I may have weighed in on that one as well.
Yeah, where he sort of makes out...
How dare Trump interfere with our domestic policies?
That's right. And
unlike, say, President Obama, and promising to put us at the back of the queue.
Exactly.
Which got no degree of hostility at the time, I seem to recall.
No, as hot takes go, I think it's about it's about as frozen as you can get, because there is a world of difference between Obama intervening stiltedly
Before the referendum took place.
Before the vote had been made. And Trump saying, well, hang on a second, these people have voted for it. Are you going to deny it to them? I can't imagine all people voting who voted Brexit, which is the majority, as you say. I can't imagine them suddenly going, oh, well, I was really for Brexit, but now President Trump has meddled in our affairs. I'm going to change my view. I mean, it's just stupid.
Have you read much from John Gray on this topic?
No. Tell me.
I've got two. There's two. I'll send you the links afterwards.
Is he a goodie?
I think he's very much a goodie. So
Okay.
I'm trying to remember where I came across this, and it might have been via Jim Mellon, but who's also someone who I've got to know through the Money Week relationship. And
yeah, we are a cabal, aren't we?
It is.
Really?
It's a secret cabal.
Dominic
It's a
Frisby.
mini Bilderberg.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I came across this article by the British philosopher John Gray, and it's in the New Statesman of all places, which I didn't, to be honest, even know was still being published.
Nobody reads it.
Because the last time I bought it was in 1985 or whenever during the Westland crisis.
Well,
so
you thought you might be left-wing.
Well, I thought I might be a bit of a lefty, but happily I swiftly became self-aware. So there's an absolutely superb piece by John Gray for the New Statesman that was written just after the referendum, and it's called "The Strange Death of Liberal Politics."
Oh yeah.
And I've tried to commit one of these lines to one of these paragraphs to memory, but it goes something like the following. It says, bear in mind this was written literally days after the vote came in, and he said, predictably there have been already calls to reverse the referendum. Those people making those calls are like bedraggled courtiers fleeing the court at Versailles, their minds unable to process the scale of the reversal they've undergone. And he talks about the shock and the unwillingness. And I'm thinking he's got it bang on. This is not merely a political thing. It's clearly ideological, but it's more like a religious mania. The people, I mean, A.C. Grayling springs to mind, but the people who are so committed to basically what I would describe as simply overturning a wholly legitimate vote.
Yeah.
They're doing so with the zeal of which Roundheads and Cavaliers were knocking slices out of each other back in the 1640s. Yeah. But it has the zeal of a religious war.
I think it does. No, I think this is our civil war, and it's extraordinary that you've got brother against brother, father against son, and I mean, we've all experienced it.
But if you take the emotion out of it, all you're really arguing about is how do you want the administrative affairs of the UK to be handled? And if you express it in those terms, it's all of a sudden it's not that contentious, is it?
No, but as you say, it's about the emotional thing. It's about a feeling. Look, one of my biggest fallings out with Remainer friends who no longer are friends, they just will not talk to me. I mean, I'm happy to talk to them. But
incidentally, just on that point, sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
it strikes me that this is like something out of propaganda school via Goebbels. I wouldn't say the Remainers, I'll say the Remoaners, i.e. the subset of sort of continuity Remain. The charge they make should be levelled against themselves, not against the Leavers. What they accuse Leavers of is exactly the behaviour they themselves are manifesting.
But this is what Remainers have in common with the radical left. It's a bit like Antifa being Antifa are the fascists, despite
moderates, conservatives, and I'd say libertarians just do not march. Only a certain type of people get on their high horse enough to march.
Yeah. So the reason I had the falling out with my Remoaner friends is I ridiculed their position thus. I said that their argument boiled down to little Johnny and Araminta won't be able to get
spend so much time so easily at the holiday home in the south of France.
Exactly. That was it. And unfortunately, there was more truth in the parody than they dared admit to themselves, because that was their only bloody argument. It's an emotional argument. It's got nothing to do with anything else.
But it's not even that they're not going to be able to access it. It's
It's an idea.
Just don't get it's an idea.
It's an idea. It was always an idea.
It's a nice sort of woolly idea about the brotherhood of man. But what is depressing is that if things had gone a different way, and again we're talking about counterfactuals, if things had gone a different way, imagine what the national mood might be like today if a Leaver had been installed as Prime Minister. Someone, dare I say it, akin to the spirit of someone like Daniel Hannan, someone who is genuinely excited and optimistic about the process of us striking out into the world. The country would be completely transformed. We wouldn't have wasted 2 years arguing with ourselves.
No, or Prime Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, indeed.
Can you imagine? We don't
I
know.
could imagine, actually. After 30 years of hurt, I could imagine 40-odd years of hurt in this case.
It would be like, I would rather Jacob Rees-Mogg became PM than if we could go back in time and beat Croatia and then beat France.
I absolutely salivate at the prospect of Jacob Rees-Mogg taking on Corbyn or McDonnell PMQs, and it would be too brutal to watch. It would be like running over a wounded animal on the side of the road and then running over it again and again and again.
Do you not think that what should happen is that, given the turmoil and confusion and this very sinister move to overturn the democratic vote, which, if it does succeed, is going to cause...
It delegitimises our democracy.
Exactly. It delegitimises democracy. It's going to make the people very, very angry and restive.
But also, I think if and when this genie is allowed out of the bottle, it never gets back in again.
No.
Because then no single vote hereafter is ever deemed to be the end of the story.
So given all those issues, is not the only solution that Theresa May has to resign? There has to be another general election.
Not necessarily. I mean, I'm not up into the full sort of constitutional minutiae of this. But is it conceivable that the Conservatives could actually arrange a bloodless transition of power? Surely it's hypothetically possible.
Yeah. I tell you what worries me at the moment is the faction led by Gove, which is saying we should stick with Theresa May's white paper.
But clearly the problem here is that it's ultimately insoluble if you have the country, and let's call it the country. I accept it was a relatively narrow majority, but it's still the country. It's a binary thing, so they either won or they didn't, and Leave won. The country said one thing. Parliament clearly does not wish to entirely support that process. All I'd say in this case, Parliament should remember who it works for.
Yeah, I agree. How much did you love Trump's intervention?
Quite a bit.
I mean, you're a fan, I take it.
I don't know quite what to make of Trump, but again, I'd
That's
cite...
a good thing, isn't it?
I'd cite John Gray. So John Gray, I mentioned him earlier on the topic of Brexit, but he's also very good on politics generally. And he wrote much more recently a piece called The Age of the Strongman. And if I can sort of remember the essence of his argument, it's that, Brexit and Trump are not isolated examples of sort of, game-changing things. This is now the new status quo, the new thing. And he makes a very good case for the fact that a lot of liberals out there are thinking of this as like bumps in the road or blips in the system, but it's not. Maybe it's actually just this is a new reality.
Well, this is why I thought it was quite interesting that Trump decided to bestow his kingmaker's crown on Boris.
On Boris, indeed.
Because obviously, apart from the blonde hair, which he would identify with, I think possibly he recognised...
A joie de vivre.
Yeah, the joie de vivre.
Fellow traveller.
I mean, look, if I had a pound for every person who told me that Boris was useless, untrustworthy, incompetent, just not an homme sérieux, unsuited for the job, I'd be incredibly rich. But Boris is still popular, and I think by rejecting Theresa May's plan, he pulled himself back from the brink of career oblivion to the possibility of being our great white hope again.
It seems to me that what Theresa May, and I don't envy the position she's got herself into, but what Theresa May has effectively proven is the veracity of the idea that you can't be all things to all people. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, you have to take a stand. And, if a certain contingent of people were not going to like that stand, so be it.
Totally.
You have to stand for something. You have to stand for conviction. And, I think maybe the real malaise of our current politics is that the number of true conviction politicians out there, on whichever side of the political debate, is vanishingly small.
Yeah. I think I can't remember who I was talking to. Was it Daniel Kavczynski? I can't remember, but somebody was saying to me that large numbers of MPs in the Conservative Party are really not there because they're Conservatives. They'll just go along with whatever sort of is the convenient thinking to keep them in power. But there are very few genuine ideologues, and I think ideologues is what we need right now. People who have
you need someone who
principles.
can nail their colours to a mast.
Yeah. Well, to use another cliche, you can't be half pregnant, and equally you can't be half Brexit. You either leave the European Union or you don't. Whereas what we're having is this kind of halfway house imposed on us.
One thing that's quite sad about it is despite the 2 years of acrimonious debate on this, I've yet to hear and I've tried to be open-minded about this, I have yet to hear any Remainer advocating any strong reasons why we should have stayed. It's only ever been couched in terms of negativity, never in terms of anything positive. And I'm just not sure that, I'm saying this with entirely conscious of said that reputation of being somewhat of a kind of a Perma Bear, but you can't just live off, if you like, Project Fear indefinitely. At some point you have to stand for something positive. Do
you know what would be really sad though? What would be really sad if we got somebody like, there's quite a few people I wouldn't mind being Prime Minister. Jacob Rees-Mogg would be great. Boris would be great. I think Gove would actually make a very good fist of it. I like Priti Patel. I don't think Sajid Javid is as bad as some people. There's a lot of kind of knee-jerk anti-Muslim stuff. I don't think he's a no-hoper just because he's
in terms of rising talent, I'd also put in a mention in dispatches to Steve Baker. I don't know that many politicians, but I happen to have met Steve once or twice, and I had it was a very, very sweet first meeting in the city, probably about 6 years ago or so, because he co-founded a site called the Cobden Centre, which you may know, libertarian think tank, free markets,
sound money,
all the right things. And they're kind enough to publish some of my commentaries from time to time. So I knew him sort of remotely, and he knew me remotely. Anyhow, our eyes met over a crowded room, and we sort of strode towards each other. And before saying anything, I whipped out my Krugerrand, and he whipped out his silver dollar. And it was a very touching sound money moment.
Yes. Yeah, no, Steve, of course, was one of those principled MPs who resigned from his government position.
And what I thought was remarkable, I don't know if you saw the footage of him on the BBC on Monday of this last week, on the Daily Politics, I think it was, and he was giving an interview, and I suspect Steve has a reputation for being amongst the most conciliatory, balanced, diplomatic, easy to get on with people in Parliament. But it seemed to me that he was absolutely seething about how he'd been treated, and David Davis had been treated the previous weekend at Chequers.
So whoever gets to be Prime Minister, if he's one
have you thought of putting your hat in the ring and maybe pursuing something in local politics?
I'd be bloody brilliant, but I think, do you know what? I think it's quite late.
Cometh the hour, cometh the man.
Yeah, I think it'd be quite a big ask to fast track me through the system that quickly. So, in the event that I don't,
I think it's like Thunderbirds. Anything can happen in the next half hour.
Anything can happen. Okay, but suppose we do get our man or woman into Downing Street, and then the global economic crash comes, and they get blamed for it, don't they?
I honestly don't think that would necessarily be an issue, to the extent that, and this is a serious point, one of the reasons why I personally decided to vote Leave was because, I would, back 2 years ago, and would make the case today, the Euro project and the European Union is a burning building. It's an unstable edifice that is crumbling. I do not want to be trapped in that building when it finally collapses. And I don't want to have to pay for the wreckage either. We've had one bailout for, let's say, malevolent forces already. I don't want to have to pay for another one.
Yeah, well, so the US economy, despite the predictions of all the experts who told us that Trump's, open quotes, unfunded tax cuts, close quotes, would lead to absolute disaster. He seems to have proved the Laffer curve right. The take of the American exchequer has actually increased. Is that right? I think it's been pretty good. So the American economy is doing pretty well, despite all the naysayers. The European economy seemed to have a bit of a recovery last year. I don't know how it's doing now. But do you reckon that the European economy is going to be the ground zero when it all kicks off?
It would not surprise me. So if I look at this from, let's say, a financial perspective or an investment perspective, I absolutely concur. I think the US is running quite hot. But that said, as an investor, if we're looking, say, particularly at things like stock markets, notwithstanding the fact that the US economy is running at a rapid clip, US equity valuations are also extremely high. Let's not forget that.
Yeah.
So one thing, for example, I use in the book, there's a graph of, I think, courtesy of Robert Schiller, who's a professor in behavioral economics at Yale. And he makes there's a little scattergram of equity market valuations from the States going back to, I think, 1870. And the bottom line of this chart shows you that once you start paying above a sort of price to earnings multiple of around 30 times for the US market, you're not going to make a positive return over a decade. Well, I think the latest Schiller PE ratio is something like 33, 34 times.
Okay.
Assuming that the future is like the past, expecting any kind of positive real return from US stocks, buying them at today's values, that might be a tough ask.
Okay, so 2 more questions. Why is gold doing so shit at the moment?
Very good question. I don't know the answer. All I know is it's an opportunity for those people who don't already have some hard money protection to buy it. I don't think it's necessarily a problem that it's not rising more rapidly. The issue, and I think we both have a sort of friend in common, a gentleman in Zurich who manages money, who's certainly taught me a lot about the gold market and investing in gold. And what he said is, the thing about gold is not so much the price, it's the ownership. You want to have access to gold. You want to have the article in your physical possession well before the circumstance which warrants that comes to pass.
Yeah.
So the fact that it hasn't really done anything for a while is not an issue.
Right. So yeah, and so you're saying you need physical gold as well.
So I just think keep the faith, as he would say.
Yeah. Okay. And the second related question is, what does one do in readiness for this when the shit hits the fan?
Well, the good news is that this is all covered in the book, Investing Through the Looking Glass, but the bad news is you'll have to buy it to find out.
Mind you, actually, how much does it cost? Only $19.99.
I mean, that's like 3 or 4 pints. It's nothing.
Yeah.
It'll give even more enjoyment than 3 or 4 pints.
Good.
Depending
All
on
right.
what you're drinking.
You're listening to the Delingpole podcast, the Breitbart production, with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Tim Price, financial advisor and author of Investing Through the Looking Glass. Thanks very much. See you next week.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson.
I want to actually take a couple of the references to Donald Trump from hip-hop. And then we're going to try to see if we can figure out why they like Donald Trump. Jay-Z said, I'm at the Trump International. Ask for me. Raekwon said, I'm the black Trump. They are comparing themselves to what he represents. His wealth, his achievement, capitalism.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson. Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.